Good morning, everyone. And it's really nice to have all of you this Sunday morning for this webinar, and uh, and it's going to be a short interaction, a short webinar or introduction, actually, to what is trauma-informed mindfulness, um, and also to say a little bit more about the upcoming workshop which we are doing in February, which will be a 3-day workshop around 18 hours on the same topic. So although it's going to be short, we can still be together in this exploration. And so I'd like to invite you, if it is possible, that maybe we can put on our videos. Yeah. And it's always nice when we are touching into the topic of maybe trauma, um, touching into the topic of mindfulness, that we come into this sense of connection and a sense of relatedness. So yeah, so just let's take a moment with that, of maybe seeing everyone on the screen, welcoming each other. And let's begin with just bringing some attention into the body. So just taking some time to feel our feet on the ground, sensing into this contact with the earth. Sensing the contact of the body to the seat, to the chair. And really resting in that contact. Just letting your attention drop into this contact with the earth and into the body. And just bringing our attention more neck down into the body. Sensing into our legs. Sensing into our hands. We're just bringing attention to whatever we are sensing in our legs, in our hands, maybe some sensations or just an awareness of the legs and hands. Just sensing into the back, the front, neck and throat. And just sensing into the head and face. So just coming into a whole body awareness. Sensing into the whole body. Just being here, just acknowledging whatever you're present to, whatever thoughts or feelings or sensations. Not needing to shift anything or change anything. Just letting everything be just as is. Sensing into the awareness of sounds and the space around us. Gently opening your eyes and taking in the visual field. And as you take in the visual field, just let your head and neck, just give it some movement by just looking around really slowly, letting your eyes fall on whatever it falls on. So, as I was sharing a little earlier, that this is a short webinar, it's an introduction to looking at trauma-informed mindfulness. And we'll just look at just this relationship, actually, we're just going to explore this morning, just this relationship between trauma and mindfulness. And maybe I will share a presentation and we'll stop and we'll look at some of those points. And then we'll have some time for just interaction and question and answers. So everyone can see the screen?
Yes, Andrade.
All right. Okay. So what are we going to be looking at in this time together? We're just going to look at, maybe initially looking at, what does it mean to be trauma informed? And since we are looking at being trauma informed in our mindfulness practice, when we are bringing mindfulness to individuals or groups, we'll also explore what's the true practice of mindfulness. What is mindfulness really attempting to do in its practice? And then what's the relationship of mindfulness practice and trauma? And along with that, we'll also cover what we are going to do, or what will the residential workshop entail. So the residential workshop on the same theme is going to happen in February from 9 to 11. It's a residential workshop which will happen in Dehradun at Tarabling, which is a really beautiful monastery, and I think not a monastery but a retreat place, and it would be very, very supportive to the exploration of this topic. What I'm sharing today is also, we cover this in our 2-year program, which is in presence oriented psychotherapy. And we touch into it in our 1-year diploma program in mindfulness based counseling. So let us look at, first of all, what does it mean to be trauma informed? Okay. Now, and I also want to say a little bit about all the pictures that I've been using, because when we are looking at trauma and when we are looking at mindfulness, and we are bringing them both together, we are really looking at coming and meeting into these uh, traumatic imprints or these traumatic patterns from a sense of presence, from a sense of spaciousness. And as we navigate this territory, that's our, in some sense, the guide, the our sense of presence and our practice of mindfulness is really the guide into these terrains. Okay. So when we are looking at if we are looking at just trauma informed, it's really an umbrella term to really indicate that we do understand the implications of trauma in whatever it is that we are offering. So we are understanding the implications of trauma, that trauma does have an impact on our physiology. Trauma does have an impact on our psyche, on our very sense of self and how we hold our sense of self, on our interpersonal relationships. So it does impact how we relate to others, how we see the world, how we see ourselves in the world. And trauma is also in the collective. So very often the response to trauma or how we hold traumatic patterns is also a result of the nature of our interpersonal relationships. And so then our care and our practices are informed by all of these aspects. Not that we have to know it in depth, but we just know enough so that we can support the practice of mindfulness, we can modify the practice of mindfulness. So being trauma informed is very different from, and there is a distinction between being a trauma informed practitioner of mindfulness and engaging in trauma resolution work. So let us just look at, and I'm not going to spend too much of time on this, but just to know that trauma shows and appears and our traumatic patterns form in different ways. Okay. So something that's called shock trauma, like for example, if we had maybe a major accident at a physical level, then that impacts us and maybe our body moves into shock and has not moved out of that shock response. So the trauma is still there in the body, right? There can be developmental trauma, which is not really maybe one incident that has happened, but over a series of incidents that have happened. Or it could be one incident that happened that may had a major impact, right? But in our early years, as we were developing as children, as we were growing up as children, and it can be even earlier, which is the pre and perinatal trauma, the trauma that we do experience when maybe at birth, before birth, after birth. And I want to also acknowledge that at every life transition, whatever life transition there is, there can be a trauma imprint depending on how we've navigated that life transition. For example, if we have from adolescence, right? That's a big life transition. Uh, Going to college, big life transition. Marriage, big life transition. So, any of these major normal life transitions, they can be a trauma imprint depending on how we have navigated it. Okay. Maybe we lost someone, maybe there's been a death, there's a loss of some sort. um, there's also what's called historical trauma, which is really the trauma that is held because of, for example, one example would be the Holocaust, the other example would be colonization. There is a collective historical trauma that is like a cultural group, a socio-cultural group is affected collectively in that because of some historical events that have happened. Okay. So both in their sense of identity and how they hold it and their response then to anything that triggers that is very similar to those original incidents, right? There's also intergenerational trauma, which is a little bit like this collective trauma or this historical trauma, but it's within that maybe that family, right? Something that has been passed on, and there's this collective trauma, which may not be just one group of people, but it is just in the collective across groups. Like for example, when we experienced COVID, so that was collective trauma affecting many people. Um, and there can be vicarious and secondary trauma when we are, and this is especially relevant to us as we are holding space for others, that as we are listening to others, as we are listening to their traumatic stories, we can also, in the resonance, our bodies can also kind of pick up and respond to this trauma. So, what is trauma then? If we see that broad range, if we had to just put it in a nutshell, right? If we had to just put it together, then trauma is or I'll say a trauma imprint, because it's just an imprint. Yeah. It's an experience of something. So, trauma is a life experience or an event or a series of life events that happens too fast, too soon, too early. Okay. So either at an individual level, at a collective level, it's just something that happens too fast, too soon, too early, right? So I've just adapted this from what Peter Levine says about trauma, and it's too fast, too soon, too early, in the sense of either we didn't have the resources that were needed at that point of time, internally and externally, to help us to move through this traumatic event. Like Peter Levine says, that trauma is not so much in the event, it's in our response to it. Okay. And very much this response to it is also a function of how we have felt held in that experience during, after, the presence and safety that we experienced as we were moving through this traumatic experience. And another key thing that we have to remember in trauma is that it is also a physiological response. So, trauma cannot be seen and cannot be met, these traumatic imprints cannot be met just at the level of the thinking mind. It affects all at all levels of our being, and definitely the physiology. So we have to include the physiology when we are looking at trauma, and we have to be aware of how the physiology is impacted uh, when there is a trauma response. This is Gabor Mate, who I really like this, how he looks at and defines trauma as a disconnection from self and a disconnection from the present moment. Peter Levine, like I shared earlier, trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. So the presence of the other, the kind, supportive presence of the other is really that antidote to trauma that we need. That if we have that, then our physiology would be able to move through how it is holding that trauma response. Because inherently, our bodies know what to do with things, but it may need a little bit of support. But no matter what we are faced with, no matter what we have experienced, there is always an ever present flow of life that keeps moving through us. So I often use this analogy of, a plant which is blocked from the light, from the sunlight. But the inherent movement of this plant is to move towards that light. So it will find its way through the cracks and crevices. It will find its way to turn towards and to move towards the light. And in a very similar way, that life force within us, right, everything within us will keep moving, will keep flowing. But all of these experiences, when we haven't been met adequately, when we haven't had the resources, adequate resources to support whatever we've been through, those create some kind of condition patterns, very much like these boulders and rocks that we are seeing. And sometimes all these boulders, these rocks, these knots of these patterns that we are carrying kind of impedes that flow of life. But life still moves. It'll find a way to move, but it still gets a little constricted. So the full expression of who we are, right? So the traumatic events kind of come in the way of that. But no matter what we have experienced, especially when we are looking at trauma from the lens of presence, no matter what we have experienced, our essential self, the core of us, of who we are at a fundamental level, that's always intact. And it's ever present. So often, an experience when we have a lot of traumatic imprints is that we feel broken, right? And we see ourselves as broken. And often that's not the case. The experience is that of brokenness, but at the core of it, there is a sense of wholeness. And that's a major assumption that we are holding when we are bringing in trauma-informed mindfulness. In how we look at the people we are interacting with, how we look at ourselves, how we look at even when these trauma imprints are showing up in the other. And that really brings us to then what is the true practice of mindfulness, right? What is it that we are attempting to do? And really, mindfulness at the core of it, and mindfulness, as you know, comes from the Buddhist practices. That's what is adapted in psychology. That's where it is adapted from. So, at the core of it, mindfulness is a pathway to presence, is a pathway to our essential self, that within us that is unbroken, that within us that's whole, that sense of a deep sense of okayness within us, no matter what we are experiencing. So it is really a myth that in mindfulness practice, that we always need to feel calm and we need to feel good. And we may not feel good and we may have whatever emotions we are having, and it may be highly unpleasant. Uh, but all of that is, there is also a sense of, a deep sense of okayness along with whatever else we are experiencing. And so holding these two together, right, that is essentially where the mindfulness practice is leading, right? So it is a practice that we come in touch with this ever-present awareness, this awareness that's always there, which is very different from saying, I'm aware of what's going on and I'm thinking about it. It's not that thinking awareness, right? It's just the quality of awareness of thoughts and feelings and sensations and sounds and everything just as is. Okay? So it's a knowing, it has a knowing quality. And there is an intimacy of experience. And as we practice, we move more deeply into the sense. It's not like everything within us feels resolved, but we move into the sense of okayness with whatever is there. And that very presence has a capacity to allow even the traumatic imprints to unfold and unravel. Now, the practice of mindfulness, it is an embodied awareness that we are talking about. And in the practice of mindfulness, we are moving just moment to moment with our experience in a non-judgmental, open, curious, and kind way. So our experience is this coming together of all these, like just a definition of what is it that is, when we are talking about what is experience, right? Experience is nothing but this kind of collection of our thoughts, feelings, and sensations together. Now, usually when we are bringing mindfulness to individuals and groups, there are many ways in which we are bringing that in, but it always usually includes some kind of formal practice, right? But we can bring mindfulness even in informal ways of just being present with whatever we are doing, because anything can be um, um, can be a pathway to practice, can be a way of practicing. Now we can have the shamatha practices, which are the calm abiding. We can have the vipassana, which is insight, looking at things just as they are. And we require this little bit of shamatha, this calm abiding, at least relatively, to look at something clearly, right? Otherwise, it's like the waters are too, then you're moving a lot, so we're not able to then see very clearly. Yeah? So a little bit of a relative amount of um, letting these waters calm down, these waters of the mind and in the body and the physiology, and then looking at something, whatever there is, looking at that a little more clearly, giving it space. Okay? And usually, in how mindfulness is applied uh, and brought in to individuals and groups, at least in psychology, is that there is a combination of both shamatha and vipassana practice together. Okay? And so to bring that kind of a relative stability of attention, we can use any of these anchors, right? Like the breath or the body sensations or body movement, sounds, the visual field, an open awareness, which is you're not really kind of like looking at any one thing in particular, but just aware of everything that is going on simultaneously. And they can also be just a recognition of awareness and presence, where that itself becomes the anchor, right? So, and any of these practices can be a shamatha practice, and it can also be a vipassana practice, okay? Where we can use the practice to really look at the deeper nature of things, to look at things as they are. Now, when we are talking about trauma that kind of like comes up in practice, because of the nature of these practices, it can also allow the traumatic imprints to show up. Okay? And so, therefore, we have to look at these practices that the mindfulness practices is not a one size fits all. We cannot say that, okay, breath, because it works for me, is good for you and is good for everyone. When you come to the breath, you know, you may generally be feeling anxious, or you may touch into something, and then the breath doesn't become an anchor at all. Because with the breath and the attention on the breath, I come in touch with the activation that is happening in my body, the higher heartbeat, the faster, rate of breathing, right? And I may get overwhelmed by these sensations and experience, and not be able to continue to be present with the breath. So then I may need something else. Like I may need to open my eyes, and I may need to use another anchor. So when do we switch, right? When do we switch from one anchor to the other? In such a way that we can still continue to remain present, right? But it is also then supportive. It allows it to be supportive, right? So we can adjust our practice accordingly. So, what's the relationship between mindfulness and trauma? So, just as we have seen the trauma imprints or the patterns of response, when we experience trauma, we said it restricts the full expression of who we are, and we lose touch with our essential nature. So, it disconnects us from self and a sense of safety with others and being in the world. Now, what mindfulness practice is doing is that by its very nature, actually, it is designed to bring us in touch with our true selves. So, and along the way, it brings us in touch with our conditioned patterns. Now, that's meant to be a good thing, because when we touch into these conditioned patterns, traumatic or not, right? It has a chance to open up into a more spacious sense of self. So, in some way, the traumatic patterns itself becomes a portal into presence. It becomes a possibility of opening up fully to who we are. It allows that imprint itself to kind of unfold. And for this, to allow for the power and the transformative power of mindfulness, how we practice and how we modify the practice, how we meet and encounter whatever it is we are encountering, that is quite critical. And that's what we will learn in the in the workshop, where we will kind of like really learn how can we really support through an understanding of the physiology, through a deeper understanding of trauma, through our own sensing and feeling of things, because a lot of this is also held by the practitioner. So whether we are holding the space for individuals or groups, our own presence has the ability to be this container for these traumatic imprints that start to show up for others in their practice. And to know, and when we learn about the physiology, we can learn the signs of what to look out for. That tells us that somebody is having a response or feeling overwhelmed, and maybe there is that's a trauma response that's coming up, right? So we have to understand that trauma patterns, they reside in the body. So it is essentially a physiological response, as we've shared. So we learn, and in mindfulness practice, we are learning to get in touch with our experience through our bodily sensations. So when we are touching into the body, we are likely to touch into these traumatic imprints. So if we are working with very, where we know that with a population that is highly traumatized, we may not begin mindfulness practice straight off into the body. We might begin mindfulness practice by just bringing attention maybe outside. You can use any anchors, right? So sound can be an anchor, right? Just a little bit of grounding can be an anchor, just feeling the feet on the ground. Externalizing can be the anchor, like using maybe material like clay or working in the mud. So there is the sensory being moment to moment with experience, but it's not so focused in the body. So we kind of have a way of slowing down what may arise. And then as capacity builds up, then we can move more closer into the body and move a little bit more of practice of just touching into the body, just a little bit, not much, and then, expanding, right? So I'm just sharing a little bit so that even this introduction can be a little useful for those attending, and you can take something back with you that you may find helpful and can apply it, and just take a note of it as you are practicing. Now, when trauma imprints are touched into, like I said, it can also bring up too much too fast. So it's like I'm touching into a deeply held pattern, and it was deeply held and protected for a reason. And now I'm practicing mindfulness and feeling safe and feeling the sense of presence. And in presence itself, there is a capacity of this transformational, almost alchemical, kind of quality of presence, that whatever it touches, it will transform it, right? So when we bring our awareness to something in the body and to a traumatic pattern, that presence, that awareness itself has the ability to transform. But as it is touching into the body and that pattern, that pattern opens up, there can be a flood of emotions that can come up that were so held back for so long, right? And so to know then how can we just support the physiology, right? Just slow it down. Just allow for the physiology, for the mind to really absorb this kind of flood of emotions that are happening. And it's like almost like you're putting a dam, right? By slowing down the practice, building more resources, bringing in more somatic practices that can help with the physiology, like, for example, touch, that can be so helpful. Yeah. Or just breathing through the belly and blowing out through the mouth. And the idea is not that we stop that experience, but just so that we can be really present and allow for that feeling and that physiological response to happen. And in some way, the antidote to trauma is safety and connection. And in mindfulness practice, we are bringing in that inner sense of safety, because we said mindfulness is also that relationship that we have with experience, which is really critical, like how we are meeting whatever is arising. That sense of kindness towards what is arising, the sense of compassion towards what is arising. And as we are holding space for others and bringing mindfulness practice to individuals and groups, then that safety that the other is experiencing with you in that relational space, that is really the buffer and the container for that traumatic imprint to unfold. So we are going to be looking at all of this a little bit more and going into the practices and just learning from the inside out and in the safety of community, the group that gathers. And that's why we have chosen to make it a residential workshop, right? So that there is enough time for rest. And it's not just information filling up. We have a lot of information on all of this on, you just type into Google and you'll get loads on trauma. And there's one thing about knowing that information, but there is another of really sensing and feeling and being together and exploring together and seeing how we are actually navigating what is arising, right? And that there's enough of time to rest, to be, to feel grounded, and to move through that exploration together. So, how we are going to explore trauma informed mindfulness is very much going to be built into the structure of the program. Yeah. So, there's the safety and containment that we'll experience in the group, and we learn about the physiology in trauma. And I want to say something about Tarabling. It's a very, very beautiful space and a space that I relish very, very much. And I think the space by itself is a good container for this exploration. So we're going to learn the essence also of mindfulness through practice. So there's going to be a lot of practice, individual practice, practice in dyads, in groups, and also learning not just about the physiology, but then also ways in which to support and modify mindfulness practices. And depending on the populations you work with, we will look at how to support that. And also learning how to create relational safety. Okay. So Priya probably is sharing with you details of, the details of the workshop and where you can find the link and the registration form. And there's a lot more that is shared on the website about what we are going to be doing, the structure of our 3 days, and the different topics that we will be covering. And like just learning about the physiology in trauma is a big topic that we are going to be touching into, as well as the polyvagal theory, which is so critical in terms of understanding how we can support and how we can support some trauma responses that come up during a practice. All right. So the website is here, justbeingcenter.com, and you can find more details there and the registration form. We are also looking at, where we can kind of really know whether we are going to be offering this workshop if we receive a uh, considerable amount of registrations. But I really, really wanted to do this workshop as a residential one, and not offer it as online or even as a weekend workshop because of the nature of the topic. And really to ensure that we have a deep sense of, or at least some sense of what it means. What does safety really mean? How do we experience it? How do we shift into it? And as we know that and learn that, then we know how to bring it more confidently to individuals and groups. I also want to say that the workshop is not going to be for, to deal with our own trauma imprints. It is meant as practitioners when we are holding space for others. And of course, something about that will come up for us as well. And that's okay. But it's not going to be a workshop where we are, going or dealing with our own trauma imprints. Okay? So it does have a learning angle to it. Okay, a little short on time, but we'll take questions and then we'll close in 10 minutes. If there are any questions, we can take that.
I wanted to say this is a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. So much was happening in the body as well as the mind that I could see its impact. That and how.
So then let's take some time. Thank you for bringing that up. And maybe before we get into questions and more talk, maybe we'll just take some time to just come into sensing the body once more, feeling the ground, and just letting the attention rest. And just for some time, just acknowledging whatever is arising, but without following anything, without trying to analyze it. Just acknowledge and just let it be. Great. And maybe once more, we can just come into, if our videos are on, we can just come into, just a group sensing and looking at each other and that really brings us into a sense of safety. Uh,
Because some of the faces are the faces I had also met when we were doing the 40 days, it's very comforting. It did not feel
yes,
that, suddenly completely alien.
yes,
So
that's
that
right.
was very nice.
Okay. And so, are there any questions for now? Or anything to share? Yeah, Anubhuti.
Thank you, Sandy. So when we do that metta practice, the compassion practice, that's an example of the shamatha practice.
Um, that's an example of a compassion practice, and that inner relationship, that inner kindness that can get evoked with that practice, right?
Okay. Yeah.
It is also in Buddhist psychology, these practices are also used as like an antidote, like it's like creating another pathway. If, like, let's say, um, like the strength of a certain pattern is very high, right? Like, let's say this maybe an anger response or some strong emotion that keeps coming up, very much like a very self-critical voice that keeps
Mm.
coming up, and we keep encountering that, then to build another pathway,
Mm.
right, which is that of self-compassion and a different relationship with ourselves and with our experiences, and extending that um, to see the connection with others as well. And that's creating a different pathway,
Right.
right?
Right.
And as that different pathway starts to develop, then our capacity to be with this emotion, the strong emotion that is coming up, that increases.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So there is this kind of like thing also in the practice of meditation of whether you directly look at trauma,
Mm.
or whether you first learn to kind of like maybe just look away and then look at it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so developing that capacity bit by bit, right?
Yeah. That's why you said in the beginning there's a difference in trauma resolution, engagement work, and then just building capacity to let the traumatic imprints surface slowly in their own time.
Yeah, and actually that's the essence of trauma resolution work also. So, so I'm a trauma therapist. My specialization is that in developmental trauma, and we always go slow.
Mm.
So you never just jump in. So it's like getting into an operation, right? I mean, you're not going to the if you're getting into surgery, the doctors are going to check into all the vital signs and the stabilization enough so that we can get into something. In the same way, that we feel stable and we feel a sense of okayness, and then we can get into something,
Right.
right? We're able to hold it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, too much comes up too fast, too soon.
Yeah. 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 Thank you.
So it's nice, even in our own practice, to go slow, to practice patience, to know that it's not something that we have to kind of like resolve. So, in the very attitudes of our mindfulness practice, actually, it is so conducive to how we can meet trauma imprints, right? Of not getting into too much of the doing mind, not trying to kind of fix things, allowing, letting it be. But just, I think it's really important to understand that this uh, doesn't come from the discursive thinking mind. So that's what we are building actually as we are practicing mindfulness. Just the space from which we are holding things.
Sandy, there was something wanted to know.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, not at the level that people are inquiring about. It's about the food. If I do get to the retreat, for some years now, my intestine is very reactive to peppers, like green or red peppers, and it goes into an intestinal trauma if I don't take care of it. So, if and when I am able to be there, uh, can we take care of the food? What is
Yeah, I think so. They have a kitchen, but we can check. And Priya is here, and we can kind of keep that in mind, and you can write to us with this kind of request and preference, and we can check with Tarabling. Yeah. Is there anything else? Yeah. So maybe if you'd like, you can just leave something in the chat. Maybe we just take a moment or two to just see how whatever we have encountered this morning, how does that sit with us? What's here? Maybe it leaves us with more questions than answers, and that's okay. Or maybe it clarifies something or makes us curious about something. So we just check in, see what's here. We put it in the chat. So Pranay, it is, yes, you need not be a therapist to do this workshop, but you need to be, engaged in some kind of holding space for others. Maybe like it's open to yoga teachers, it is open to school teachers, anyone bringing mindfulness to groups, right? So you don't have to be a therapist to attend this workshop. So it's not in that sense, what do we need to do therapeutically when faced with it, is just in terms of being trauma informed when we are bringing mindfulness to individuals and groups. Yeah, Anubhuti, you can write to us about that. All right. So maybe we can end here, and hope to meet you all in some form, some place, somewhere. And you can just continue to put things in the chat or questions, and Priya and I will be there, and Neeti is also here, and we can look at that together.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandy. Hope to see you too soon.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Shilpa. Good to see you.
Thank you, Sandy, for this wonderful, wonderful.
Thanks, Gayatri.
And yeah, thank you.